Right, good evening everyone. Welcome, whether you are here, present at Covent Garden, whether you're watching live on YouTube, or whether you're watching at a later date on YouTube. Welcome to you all. The usual house management for those that are here in person. We're not expecting any alarms to go off, and hopefully they won't. But if they do, you have an exit behind me, in front of you, on the right-hand side, or if it's safe to do so, you can go out the way you came in. But in all emergency circumstances, we'll be guided by our museum manager. Okay, before I introduce tonight's speaker, just a little look ahead to what's coming up. Our last meeting in the calendar year of 2021 will be on Monday the 13th of December in 4 weeks' time. That will be a talk by Oliver Green on London's great railway stations. That talk coincides almost precisely now, because I think the publication has been put back a few weeks, of a book that Oliver Green has written on that very subject, London's railway stations, with photos by a colleague of his, Benjamin Graham. If you do come to that meeting, and if you are minded to purchase a copy of the book, and if you so wish, Oliver will sign those books for you before he gives his presentation on the 13th of December. We have two notified visits and other events coming up, both of which were in the last issue of Friends News. There's a walk around this area here, London Theatreland, on the evening of the 5th of December, and looking much further ahead, there is a Sunday lunch on the Kent and East Sussex Railway on the 10th of April next year. There are still places on both of those, so if you are interested, please follow the instructions in the issue of Friends News as to how you book and reserve a place. We are working on more visits, at least two of which will take place before the April event in early 2022, and the details of those will be in the January issue of Friends News. I think that's all I need to say by way of general introduction and parish notices, so let me introduce, without further ado, our speaker, Mike Ashworth, who will be known to many of you, I guess. He was, prior to retirement, the Underground's Design and Heritage Manager, and before that, 30 years ago, he tells me, he was a curator here at London Transport Museum. He's going to talk tonight on the more recent addition to the Underground Heritage, which is the architecture of the Jubilee Line. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Barry. Good evening. It always worries me slightly when you applaud before I start talking rather than when I finish. But yes, it's a pleasure to be back here in Covent Garden. It's always strange when you retire from a place. Obviously, I left London Underground 4 years ago, and I feel as if I should be an exhibit in the museum. But my career path was slightly unusual in that I started here and went into the operational railway in around 2001. And as Barry said, I was the Design and Heritage Manager for London Underground. And that had three major responsibilities. One of which was obviously the conservation of the Underground's heritage. So that was responsibility with the management of nearly 80 listed buildings out of 275. And a very large number of railway heritage features that we ourselves in London Underground had. I was also responsible for customer-facing aspects of station and train design, which is a polite way of saying the architecture of rebuilt and new stations, and also underground rolling stock. So it was a unique experience to work for the Underground for so many years with such a widespread remit over the company's history. The one thing that retirement enables you to do, although Barry says I have to be careful what I say, is it means I'm no longer quite as constrained as I was when I worked for the company in terms of what I can discuss about stations. And what we're going to look at this evening is a very personal take on some of the Jubilee Line Extension stations that, of course, opened in 1999 and 2000, just on the cusp of 2000. And it was one of the earliest projects I became involved in when I started working for London Transport Museum, and that we were amongst the first people on the day that the Underground took occupancy of the old St Stephen's Club at Westminster, And I was also there on the day that station opened. It was 28th of December 1999. And the museum were actively involved in the JLE project. We stole quite a lot of things for the museum, including a section of the original 1890 tunnel, the CSLR tunnels from London Bridge. I think we asked for 3 complete rings and they sent us 2 lorry loads, which was slightly embarrassing at the time. And also an attempt to get a complete district railway column out of Westminster Station, which failed when the tower crane started to bend over. But nevertheless, the Jubilee Line Extension was is quite close to my heart, both in terms of the fact that I saw it being constructed, I saw it being opened, and then I became responsible for effectively ensuring that these very important stations, which now form part of the Underground's history, that might seem slightly strange for stations that I think we still regard as being quite modern and new. Many of you will know the story. There are the tortuous story of the Jubilee Line, but I thought it would be useful to actually just nip back into the past a little bit. The logo that I'm showing on the screen at the moment, of course, is from the 1979 opening brochure designed by William Fenton, ARA. And I must admit, I've always rather liked this. You don't see this as often as you see, say, the Victoria Line opening logos. But I thought we'd just have a skip back and have a little look. First of all, I won't be stopping at every station on the extension, you'll be pleased to know. We will be skipping quite a few, skip-stop service in this case. But it will give us an opportunity to look at some of the key ones, and I think probably the most interesting ones on the line extension. But as I mentioned, give you a little taster of where we'll be going and what we'll be looking at. I won't ask you to shout the answers out. I'll ask you that at the end of the talk. Make sure you've all been listening. But of course, the history of the Jubilee Line, bizarrely, goes back to London's oldest underground railway, in that respect, the Metropolitan Railway. And in fact, the origins of some of the planning issues and debates around the Jubilee Line largely go back to the opening of the Stanmore branch of the Metropolitan, which occurred in 1932. And you can see there, that's the brochure for the opening of it. But it did leave the Metropolitan Railway with a bit of a headache, and of course that headache rapidly transferred to London Transport when it was formed in 1933. And that was the Metropolitan's longing for building branches into rural Middlesex so it could enable house building, led to some severe congestion problems south of its station at Finchley Road into Baker Street, which is still to this day only a 2-track railway, 2-track tunnel. And the Metropolitan itself had various ideas to deal with that issue, which largely coalesced around the idea of building some sort of deep-level tube line, which either would have terminated at Baker Street or in a loop under central London. But the Met never really got that off the stocks, and it was left to London Transport and the New Works programme of 1935 to 1940 to look at some options around easing the congestion on that section of the Metropolitan. That came in the form of a new tunnel, largely as the Metropolitan had the ideas, a new tunnel running south from Finchley Road with cross-platform interchange, dropping down to 2 new stations, including St John's Wood and Swiss Cottage, and then linking in to the existing Bakerloo line to form a second northern branch from the original 1906 railway. And that opened, as you can see there, on the 20th of November 1939, one of the last acts, pre-war acts, of the New Works programme, of course, which subsequently saw subsequent delays and indeed cancellations of part of its programme due to wartime extinguishers. I thought I'd just throw that little vignette in. It's actually from probably about 1950 in an Ian Allen book. It's by A&W Wolstenholme in Scraperboard. And it gives you an idea, really, actually, of course, of the new tube railway, the 1938 rolling stock there on the left, on the Bakerloo line Stanmore branch, just north of Neasden with a power station in the background. And of course, this was to be a very familiar sight on the Bakerloo line for many years. Just to give you an idea of 2 maps there. The 1939 map shows quite clearly the dotted line showing the extension of the Bakerloo line, which of course was only actually new between Finchley Road and Baker Street. You can see there Acacia Road Station was one of the proposed names. And the Bakerloo basically became very successful. The proposed extension to Camberwell that you can see on the second map here, the 1950 map, was partially designed to enable a better service by building a more operational terminus at Camberwell with 3 platforms rather than the crossovers that we still have at Elephant and Castle. Because in fact, the Bakerloo Line Extension gave the Bakerloo overall a bit of a problem. The central area became extremely stressed, and indeed during the 1950s and into the 1960s at various times, the Bakerloo was one of the most crowded lines in the central area. And of course, any railway that has a single branch at one end and 2 branches at the other does lead to some degree of operational complexity in terms of flighting trains and ensuring that timetables work. So various proposals to assist in breaking that problem came up. And they were largely around, I won't go too much into the history of the post-Second World War plans for London railways. Suffice to say, of course, that one that was built almost in its entirety, Line C, the Victoria Line, but there was also a series of east-west lines, Lines 3 and 4, which basically looked at extending some form of railway in deep level under the City of London and out either north or south of the River Thames. And London Transport worked this up, post-Victoria Line, and started to look at what was to be called the Fleet Line, basically because it ran underneath Fleet Street. I think a lot of people think it's associated as it is obviously with the Fleet River, although I think it follows the Tyburn arguably more closely in terms of where the line was going. And construction started on this section south of Baker Street to split the Bakerloo back up again. And that opened the first section between Baker Street and Charing Cross in 1979. Now, the name had been formalised around the Jubilee Line in 1977. And just a couple of illustrations here. One very fine, one of the, almost I think probably the last of the cutaway diagrams of stations issued by a poster for London Transport, showing changes at Bond Street Station. The top right shows you some of the very typical late 70s internal architecture on Jubilee Line stations. This is at Baker Street and includes the very fine panels by Robin Jakes, who of course was Hattie Jakes' brother. And I must admit, when I was in charge of such things in the Underground, I made a very strong case for retention of the panels here at Baker Street, but also at least one of this style of architecture. And it's a bit out of fashion at the moment, sort of pop art, lurid colours, but probably Bond Street or Green Park is one of the best examples. But I have to admit to playing a role in getting rid of the lime green ticket kiosks that you see down below here at Charing Cross. They were a particular dislike of one senior manager in the Underground, and when we did the work at Charing Cross a few years ago, these were one thing that went. And in a bizarre way, I have slight regrets. They were so unusual and so different. You never know, in 50 years' time, somebody might be applying for a grant to rebuild those, in which case I'd best keep a low profile. The interesting things in some respects started with what to do east of Charing Cross. I could spend an entire lecture discussing the options that London Transport and the politicians went through at various times during the 70s and 80s. Would it go north of the river? Would it go south of the river? Would it go to Thamesmead? Would it go to Lewisham? Would it take the East London Line extension over? As you can see here, 101 different routes, perhaps not as many as 101, but quite a sizable number of options were looked at. But the development of the Docklands by the late 1980s really started to spur serious thought, actually, as to helping drive the redevelopment of the eastern parts of London with not only the DLR but also some form of heavy metro. And the River Line, as it became known at one point, very soon became effectively part of the eastern extension. And you can see in the brochure from 1979 here on the right that there were a very strong case at the time to drive it to 2 branches, one at Beckton, where the depot would have been, and the other south of the river to Thamesmead. But a lot of development, well, not a lot, there was some development money put into the options for this, which meant that Canary Wharf soon started to become the main focus of the new extension. And indeed, a change of terminus to drive it north, partially using XBR lands, to a new terminus at Stratford. And this was largely sanctioned in 1990 under a new Act of Parliament, and construction largely started in 1993. There were some earlier works around 1991-92 in terms of preparation, but the real digging of the holes started in 1993. Now, I'm sure, given what's going on with Crossrail stroke the Elizabeth line at the moment, I think many of us who were in the company or associated with the company at the time, the construction and opening of the Jubilee line seemed to be quite a torrid affair. It's interesting watching what Crossrail and Elizabeth lines are going through at the moment. The delays in construction of the Jubilee line were largely caused by the collapse at Heathrow of the tunnels being built for the Heathrow Express using the new Austrian tunnelling method. And that certainly caused some substantial, nearly a year's delay to construction on parts of the actual Jubilee line itself. But nevertheless, the line was opened eventually in 19 sections in 1999, and just shy of the year 2000 in the Millennium Dome, of course, which was constructed at North Greenwich. And interestingly enough, North Greenwich was one of the latter stations planned on the line. Originally, it would have stayed north of the river. But again, as a development opportunity, and the opportunity to drive it through a brownfield site at North Greenwich was taken, and the station was built then. We should now finally start looking at some station architecture, shouldn't we? But it's important, before we start talking about the stations themselves, to mention this man, who I met once in his office at Canary Wharf when I was stealing things for the museum. Roland Paolotti was the consulting and commissioning architect for the Jubilee Line Extension. Now, his appointment, I have been told, ruffled a few feathers in London Transport's architects department at the time. He was, I think the Underground's own architecture department felt that they should have possibly a bigger role in it. But Paolotti, of course, came with a lot of experience, most notably from the Hong Kong Metro. And he commissioned not only some very interesting architects, but he allowed them a degree of latitude in terms of the fact that each station, although they had to conform to certain, if you like, guiding rules, nevertheless, each of the stations and the architects had quite a degree of latitude in what it was they could do with that station site once they had the brief for the actual requirements for the operational station. Paolotti's feeling was that the line itself would be held together by a series of common design threads, one of which was the use of materials, so largely industrial, this large-scale use of exposed concrete, the very bare bones of many of these stations, the use of corporate colours such as blue and grey, and important company, if you like, trademarks, signage, the use of Johnson lettering, the frieze plates that would help tie the line identity together very strongly, from Stratford through to the new terminus, of course, at Westminster and Green Park, because the extension meant the closure of the existing Charing Cross branch of the railway. So we'll start looking at some sites, and in fact the first one we look at isn't a station. Stratford Market Depot was constructed on the site of the old West Ham Abbey, and in fact the site clearance involved the exhumation of a very large number of Cistercian monks' bodies, which were relocated to a new funeral plot, I think in Suffolk, if I remember rightly. But nevertheless, this is really a very impressive building. I don't know if any of you have ever had the chance to visit it. We used to do open house tours here. And it really is quite remarkable. You see this vast single-span roof at an angle, which accommodates effectively all the train roads that you can see, the large Johnson numerals up above. And it means that inside you have this entirely uncluttered floor space. There are no upright stanchions within the car sheds themselves. And the control room that you see just to the left here, in rather a 1930s style in some respects, slightly circular, but of course to give full vision across the depot fan and onto the railway itself. And I must admit, I've always felt this is, amongst the many impressive pieces of architecture on the JLE, this is actually probably one of the best ones. It's one that you'll least likely see. You get glancing, fleeting views of it if you're on the train going to or from Stratford. But if you ever do get, I don't know if Open House still do tours here, if you ever do get the chance to visit it, it really is well worth a look. This was by Chris Wilkinson, the architect. It opened in 1998, and the reason for a depot at West Ham Stratford was quite straightforward. First of all, it was to allow, of course, easier operation from the east end of the railway, the new line, and secondly, to relieve congestion at Neasden, where, of course, previously the Jubilee Line stock had actually been maintained. It was far too small for the requirements of the new line itself. But we're actually going to pop back on the train now and go one station south, which is West Ham. I've always liked this station. I must admit, for various reasons. It took a while to grow on me, but it's by Van Hennigan and Howard. And it's an interesting layout, of course, in that the station isn't just single entrance. It has to deal with quite complex flows in terms of the interchange between the district, Network Rail or C2C lines, the Jubilee Line Extension and what is now the DLR. So this requires not only, if you like, a degree of flow across the site, but it also requires passengers to move through different levels to achieve that interchange. You actually have to come downstairs off the District Line platform to go back upstairs to get across to the Jubilee and the DLR platforms. So in fact, the flow, if you like, the vertical flow as well as the horizontal flow of passengers through this station is quite complex, and it requires a change of direction at least twice. So it's a complex puzzle in many respects to actually design in terms of the flow that you require of customers. In many respects, of course, it echoes back to some of the Charles Holden stations of the 1930s, in that what you have here is a much more modern take on exposed reinforced concrete with brick infill, on a much bigger scale, of course. But I think, interestingly enough, again, with the use of the clock tower, for example, if you look at somewhere like Osterley or Boston Manor, an idea of a focal point for the grouping of the station itself. And the brickwork actually is very well done. It's very well executed at this station site. So this is the street entrance, which is actually where the minimal of passengers enter and leave this station because of the interchange. But moving in, on the left there you see the actual main ticket hall. And again, quite strong echoes in some respects of Charles Holden's buildings. This is a very long, thin, narrow space. So in fact, actually, the lift, the visual lift up to the ceiling here is quite impressive in a way. But it's very intuitive in terms of it leads you through to the main exchange hall that you see here on the right. And you can see there the low level of the bridge that is required effectively underneath the C2C and the district lines to enable interchange onto those two existing lines. If we swing round to the main escalator bank, and again here you can see really the form of a large atrium with the escalators moving customers up to the upper bridge deck level with the lifts. And again, the use of exposed brickwork and a very industrial feel to the interior. There's absolutely no attempt here at disguising service runs. It's all very industrial, but it's remarkably well handled in many respects. The top left photo there shows you the overbridge itself as it lifts over the road that separates the two sites. And the main picture here shows you the interior of that crossover bridge. It's not crossover bridge, I should say. It's quite well behaved, but nevertheless, it's an overbridge across the tracks, I should say, shouldn't I? You can edit that out afterwards. But what you see here, again, is two main things. First of all, that very exposed nature of the soffits with the services threaded through, and also the light. And this was achieved by using a very simple solution, which is large proportions of these square glass blocks, which of course adapt to the modularity of the space itself and also allow a large amount of light to flow into the station. So it gives you a very clean line in many respects to the interior. The lower left photo just gives you an idea, looking back on the station, of what that achieves in terms of the stacking nature of what are effectively these glass cubes on top of the plinth formed out of brick. So it gives you a very, very strong succession down the staircases onto what here are the DLR platforms themselves. This is the top of the escalators down onto the Jubilee Line platforms, with the side flanking passageways leading to the lifts at the far end. And again, you can see the continuity of design all the way through this station. There's a very consistent flow of approach. And down onto the platform, which are actually very high structures. In a way, you could have argued, I suppose, as a designer, that you might have wanted to try and subdivide that internal elevation. But here, actually, they're carried full height to the top of the building line, straight across. But you can see here very clever use, again, echoing some of the 1930s design details. These very carefully designed brick recesses, which act as the back of the seating panels, which actually are built in, which is always a nice touch. And the fact, actually, that the benches aren't added into the design here, they're actually an integral part of the fabric of the station. And again, finished off in a way by the use of the large roundels acting as the backing of that. And an ex-colleague of mine showing that those benches are used. It looks like Edmund Bird, TfL's heritage advisor. But to give you an idea of the scale of the station with one of the Jubilee Line trains sitting in it. I must admit, I think this is really an impressive station in terms of one of our more modern ones. I do like its hints at the architecture of the past, but it really does bring a very modern, quite sparse feeling to the late 20th century architecture on the Underground. So a very impressive site. We're moving down the line now. We're not going to stop at Canning Town because, as I say, we might be here too long if we do that. But we are actually going to look at, well, a bus station rather than the tube station for a moment, which is one of the most threatened buildings on the network at the moment. And I will come back to this issue, I think, towards the end of the talk. But redevelopment has been threatening North Greenwich bus station, which was designed by Sir Norman Foster and partners, which I suspect is a great shame. Because not only is this interesting from an architectural point of view, it's also actually a fairly remarkable bus station. And it's interesting at the moment, I've been doing some work working with Save Britain's Heritage and the 20th Century Society. And I think those of us in the industry have been aware for a long time of the rate of attrition of bus and coach stations in the UK. And really are becoming quite an endangered species. And it's strange that one of the most modern ones in Britain, and arguably one of the most successful ones, is indeed itself now, just over 30 years on from opening, threatened with demolition. What Foster does is he uses this great sweeping semicircle of a building to encapsulate the upper shaft, escalator shaft levels of North Greenwich Tube Station. And this very wide aspect, of course, allows for an easy flow of buses around the perimeter which forms the bus station. And the very uncluttered nature of the interior means that the customer can have very clear sight lines through to the vehicles and also to the stops that they require. And it's proved to be a remarkably important interchange. And the car parking at this site, for example, was certainly, when I worked for the company, one of the most important access points for mobility impaired passengers, because obviously the extension generally was, at the time, one of the most enabling for people with impaired mobility. And also the car parking here is actually remarkably close to the station. So I'm really hoping that later or current plans for this station actually retain this building. I think it's an incredibly important one. And of course we shall be coming back to Foster in a minute. But we're going to turn our attention now to what goes on underground in the great box that was dug at North Greenwich and have a brief look at the station that was designed and built by Alsop, Lyle and Stormer. And this is really quite a tour de force in many respects. The station box is remarkably wide because at this point the tracks actually, there are 3 tracks. There's turnback siding at North Greenwich. North Greenwich was initially proposed to be one of the more important turnback sites for trains to reverse. Originally there wasn't a feeling that not every train needed to go to Stratford, and my how that has changed over the years. So it's a remarkably wide station box. And you approach by coming down the escalators, and the one thing that you do get here is effectively you can see the full length of the box, because the architects chose to suspend the upper mezzanine deck right across the middle of the box. It straddles the box. And this allows you very clear views of actually where the entrances and exits to the platforms are, which of course are the next level down. It's similar in some respects in concept to what's being delivered at Whitechapel for the Crossrail works, where of course the new main entrance and ticket hall effectively lifts over what was the East